The final bid was a laugh. It echoed off the stone front of the mercantile, a sound like gravel thrown against a barn door. It was not a kind sound. It was the sound of men who knew their own value and were watching someone else's be set at zero. Alara stood on the auction block. It was not a real auction block. It was the top step of the land office, which was worse. It made the whole affair feel official, legal. Her father stood beside the auctioneer, a man named Miller whose breath smelled of cheap whiskey and desperation. Miller was selling off the last of the farm's assets. 2 mules, a plow, a collection of rusted tools, and Alara. She was the final lot. A strong back and a wide hip, Miller shouted, his voice cracking. He was trying for jovial, for the tone of a man selling prize livestock. He landed on pathetic. Guaranteed obedient. Knows her place. What am I bid for a 5-year contract? 5 years of a wife's work without the trouble of a wife's tongue. Someone in the crowd snickered. Alara kept her eyes fixed on a loose board in the town's boardwalk across the street. She counted the splinters. 7 large ones, a dozen small. If she focused on the board, she could pretend the gazes were not on her. She could pretend the whispers were about the price of feed. $10, a voice called out. It was followed by another wave of laughter. $10 was an insult. It was the price of a lame horse. Alara felt her father flinch beside her. He was a small man made smaller by failure. The drought had taken his crops. The fever had taken his wife, and pride had taken the rest. All he had left to sell was his daughter's future. He had told her it was this or the workhouse. He had not said it with sorrow. He had said it with the flat finality of a man closing a ledger. $10 is the bid, Miller said, trying to inject some energy into the humiliation. Do I hear 20? A sturdy woman, gentlemen. Can cook, can clean, can carry a heavy load. $20 for 5 years of peace and quiet. A man in the front row, a pig farmer named Hemlock with stains on his shirt and cruelty in his eyes, looked her up and down. He licked his lips. Alara's stomach turned to ice. She knew him. He beat his animals. He beat his last wife. 15, Hemlock grunted, and the crowd roared. He was haggling downward. He was making a sport of it. Her father's hand shot out and grabbed her arm, a pincer grip. She's worth more than that. He hissed, not at the crowd, but at her, as if the insult was her fault, as if her plain face and heavy-boned frame were a personal betrayal to him. The shame was a physical thing. It was a hot cloak on her shoulders, a lead weight in her gut. She had been raised to be invisible, to take up as little space as possible. Now she was the center of a spectacle, the punchline to a town's cruel joke. And something inside her broke. It was not a loud shatter, but a quiet, clean snap. The part of her that had always tried to please, to be good, to earn a sliver of affection, it simply ceased to exist. In its place, a cold, hard anger began to grow. She lifted her head. She stopped looking at the splintered board. She looked at Hemlock. She met his greasy, triumphant gaze and held it. She did not flinch. Then she looked at the other men in the crowd. The store owner who had denied them credit. The blacksmith who had smirked at her worn dress. The pastor who had preached about charity on Sunday and now watched a human being be sold for less than a sack of grain. She looked at each of them one by one. She memorized their faces. She memorized their complicity. 20, a voice said. The voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise. It came from the back of the small crowd, from a man leaning against the wall of the saloon. He was tall, dressed in worn denim and leather, his face shadowed by the brim of a dusty hat. He was not a part of the town's mocking circle. He was an observer. Miller squinted.
$20?
I have a bid of 20-inch. Hemlock spat on the ground. 25. He was not going to be outbid by a stranger. This was his town. This was his sport. 100, the stranger said. His voice was flat. It was not the voice of a man bidding. It was the voice of a man ending a conversation. A stunned silence fell over the crowd. $100 was a fortune. It was more than the mules and the plow combined. It was a preposterous sum. Hemlock's face purpled. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He could not match it. He was a man of small cruelties and even smaller means. Miller, a new, desperate hope in his eyes, looked around. $100. Do I hear 110? Going once, going twice. He looked at Hemlock, who just glared at the stranger. Sold. For $100. To the gentleman in the back. Alara's father let go of her arm. His relief was so profound it made her sick. He did not look at her. He looked at the money that would save him. The transaction was completed. Papers were signed. Coins clinked. Her life was exchanged for a leather pouch. The stranger walked toward her. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy, the way a wolf moves through tall grass. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. He took off his hat. His face was weathered, carved by sun and wind. His eyes were a pale, assessing blue. They looked at her not the way Hemlock had, not like a piece of meat, but the way a man looks at a fence that needs mending. He was calculating what was broken and what it would take to fix it. He did not smile. He simply nodded. Miss, he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones rolling in a riverbed. I am Silas Blackwood. It is time to go. She walked down the steps. She did not look back at her father. She did not look at the townspeople who were already beginning to disperse, their entertainment over. She looked only at the dust on her own worn boots. She had been sold. It was done. But as she followed Silas Blackwood to a wagon at the edge of town, a vow formed in the cold, hard space where her hope used to be. She would survive this. She would work for this man. She would do what was required. But she would never trust him. She would never trust any man again. She would rely on herself and herself alone. The world had shown her its true face. She would be a fool to ever forget it.
Vuge.
The alley behind the mercantile was a narrow slice of shadow and quiet. It smelled of damp earth and discarded things. Alara leaned against the rough brick wall, the grit pressing into her back. The sounds of the town, the departing wagons, the murmur of voices, seemed a world away. Here, in the cool darkness, the dam broke. The tears came without a sound. They were not the soft tears of grief. They were hot, angry tears that scalded her cheeks. They were the release of a lifetime of being told she was too much and not enough. Too large, too plain, too quiet. Not pretty enough, not delicate enough, not worthy of notice unless it was to be scorned. Her father had never wanted a daughter like her. He had wanted a son to work the farm, or a pretty daughter to marry off well. He had gotten Alara, who could read a field better than he could, who understood the rhythms of soil and water, but who had none of the currency that mattered in the world. She had no beauty. She had no dowry. She slid down the wall until she was sitting in the dirt, her knees drawn up to her chest. She wrapped her arms around them, holding herself together. The sobs were silent, wrenching things that shook her entire body. She cried for the girl who had tried so hard to earn a kind word from her father. She cried for the woman who had been appraised and sold like a broodmare. She cried for the future that had been stolen and replaced with $100 contract. A man had bought her. Another man had sold her. A crowd of men had watched and laughed. They were all the same. They saw her as an object, a tool, a body to be used. They did not see a mind that could calculate crop yields in her head. They did not see hands that could set a broken bone or gentle a spooked horse. They saw wide hips and a strong back. Nothing more. The anger burned hotter than the grief. It was a clean, purifying fire. It burned away the last vestiges of the timid girl she had been. It forged something new in the ashes. She would not be broken by this. She would not be made into Hemlock's plaything or her father's forgotten burden. She belonged to the Silas Blackwood now, for 5 years. She would honor the contract because her word was her own, the only thing they had not been able to sell. But her spirit, her mind, her core, that was not part of the bargain. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, smearing dirt and tears. Her breathing steadied. The cold resolve settled deep in her bones. Never again. Never again would she allow her worth to be determined by the gaze of a man. Never again would she hope for kindness where there was only commerce. She would build a wall around her heart so high and so thick that no one could ever touch it. She would be a fortress of one. She would work. She would endure. She would observe. And when her 5 years were done, she would walk away and build a life of her own. A life where she answered to no one. It was a vow made in shadow and shame, a promise whispered to the dirt and the rats. It was the hardest, truest thing she had ever known. A pair of boots appeared at the edge of the alley. Worn leather scuffed at the toes. They stopped a few feet from her. It was him, Silas Blackwood. She did not look up. She braced herself for an order, a command, a reminder of who owned her time now. He said nothing. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer. He was just standing there, waiting. He was not tapping his foot. He was not clearing his throat. He was simply present, a solid, unmoving shape in her peripheral vision. Finally, his low voice broke the silence. "The contract was for labor," he said, his words careful, measured. "It was not for purchase." Alara looked up, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. His face was unreadable, the shadows of his hat hiding his expression. "It felt like a purchase," she said, her voice rough from crying. "I know what it felt like," he replied. "I was there." He paused. "Your father was going to sell your contract to Hemlock for $20 after the show was over. That was their deal. The auction was just for sport, to humiliate him. And you." The coldness in her gut intensified. Of course. It was even crueler than she had imagined. "Why would you care?" she asked, the question sharp as a shard of glass. He shifted his weight. "I don't hold with men like Hemlock. And I needed a housekeeper." He made it sound simple. A business transaction. But $100 was not a simple sum for a housekeeper. She knew a lie when she heard one, even a well-intentioned one. It was still a lie. "Here are the terms," he went on, ignoring her question. "You will have your own room. It has a lock on the inside. You will have the key. You will be paid a wage of $2 a month. Separate from this," he gestured vaguely back toward the town. "Your work will be running the house. Cooking, cleaning, mending. If you do work beyond that, you will be compensated fairly. You are free to leave at any time. Your contract will be void, and I will consider the $100 a loss." Alara stared at him, speechless. A lock, a wage, the freedom to leave. These were not the terms of a sale. They were the terms of employment. Unheard of employment, but employment nonetheless. "Why?" she asked again, her voice smaller this time. He looked away from her, toward the mouth of the alley. "My father taught me you judge a person by their actions, not their reputation. You'll be judged by the work you do. Nothing more. The wagon is ready." He turned and walked away without waiting for a reply. He expected her to follow. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs stiff. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and distrust. A lock on the door. It was a promise of safety. A wage. It was an acknowledgement of her work's value. The freedom to leave. It was a recognition of her personhood. It had to be a trick. It was a more sophisticated trap than Hemlock's, but a trap all the same. Men did not offer such things without wanting something in return, something more than cooking and cleaning. She hardened her heart. She remembered her vow. She would take the room. She would take the wage. She would hold the key in her hand and know that her safety was her own responsibility. She would work and she would watch and she would wait for the other shoe to drop. Because it always did. She stepped out of the alley and into the harsh sunlight, leaving the shadows behind. She walked toward the wagon, her back straight, her face a mask of neutrality. She was no one's victim. She was a survivor, and her war had just begun. The journey to his ranch was silent. Silas Blackwood handled the horses with a quiet competence, his hands gentle but firm on the reins. He did not try to make small talk. He did not look at her. He seemed as self-contained and remote as the distant mountains. Alara sat on the hard wooden bench, her hands clasped in her lap. She observed everything. The way the land changed from the dusty flatness around the town to rolling hills covered in dry grass. The quality of his horses, strong, well-fed, their coats brushed. The state of his wagon, old, but with well-greased axles and sturdy wheels. He was a man who took care of his tools. She catalogued these details as if they were evidence. She was building a case, trying to understand the man who had paid $100 to prevent a cruelty, only to frame it as a simple hiring. They had been on the road for nearly an hour when her stomach rumbled. It was a loud, embarrassing noise in the quiet of the open country. She had not eaten since the night before, a thin slice of bread and a cup of water. In the chaos and humiliation of the morning, food had been the furthest thing from her mind. Now the emptiness was a hollow ache. She pressed a hand to her stomach, willing it to be silent, her cheeks burning with a familiar shame. Her body was always betraying her. It was too big, too loud, too hungry. Silas heard it. She saw the slight, almost imperceptible tilt of his head. He did not comment. He just kept his eyes on the road. A few minutes later, he pulled the wagon to a stop under the shade of a lone cottonwood tree. "Horses need a rest," he said, his voice even. He climbed down and, without another word, went to the back of the wagon. He returned with a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. He held it out to her. "Are you hungry?" he asked. The question was so simple, so direct. It was not an accusation. It was not a joke. It was a plain question about a basic human need. No one had asked her that question with genuine concern in years. Food was a resource, something to be earned, something to be rationed. Her father ate first. She ate what was left. She stared at the bundle in his hand. She did not want to take it. Taking it felt like accepting a kindness, and kindness was a currency she did not trust. It created a debt she did not want to owe. "I'm fine," she said, her voice tight. He did not pull the bundle back. He just kept holding it out. His pale blue eyes were steady on hers. "There's no shame in being hungry," he said quietly. "It just means you're alive." His words struck her with the force of a physical blow. No shame in being hungry. It was a revolutionary idea. She had been taught her hunger, her size, her very presence, was a burden, a thing to be apologized for. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and took the bundle. Her fingers brushed against his. His hand was rough and calloused, the hand of a man who worked hard. There was no tremor in it, no artifice. She looked down at the cloth in her lap. She unwrapped it. Inside were 2 thick slices of bread, a wedge of cheese, and an apple. It was simple food, but it was a feast. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. He just nodded. He walked over to check on the horses, giving her space. He was deliberately not watching her. He was giving her the dignity of eating in private, without the weight of his gaze. She took a bite of the bread and cheese. The flavor was overwhelming. Her hunger was so deep it was almost painful to satisfy it. She ate quickly at first, then forced herself to slow down, to chew, to make it last. She saved the apple for last, its sweetness a shocking luxury. As she ate, a small, treacherous crack appeared in the wall she had built around her heart. It was the first act of non-transactional kindness she had received in a very long time. He had asked if she was hungry. He had said there was no shame in it. He had given her food and the privacy to eat it. It did not mean she trusted him, but it meant he was different. And for the first time in a day that had held nothing but despair, a tiny, cautious flicker of something that was not quite hope, but was at least curiosity, began to stir within her. She finished the apple down to the core and carefully folded the cloth. She would wash it for him when they arrived. It was a debt she could repay. A simple, straightforward transaction that she could understand. Chug. The ranch was nestled in a wide, shallow valley, a collection of weathered gray buildings hunkered down against the wind. A 2-story house, a large barn, a handful of smaller outbuildings, and a web of corrals. From a distance, it looked solid.
Permanent.
Up close, it was fraying at the edges. Alara saw it all as they approached. A section of fence was down, held together with baling wire. The barn roof was missing shingles in a dozen places. The paint on the house had been scoured away by years of sun and dust, leaving the wood exposed and vulnerable. The place was not dying, but it was struggling. It was holding on by a thread. It reflected the man who owned it. Strong, functional, but worn down by a long, hard fight. As they pulled into the yard, an older man emerged from the barn. He was wiry and tough, his face a roadmap of wrinkles. He walked with a slight limp. He stopped and watched their approach, his expression unreadable. "Jed," Silas said with a nod. "This is Alara. She'll be running the house." The man, Jed, looked at her. His gaze was sharp and appraising. It was not unkind, but it missed nothing. He looked from her to Silas, a question in his eyes. Silas offered no further explanation. Jed just grunted. "Supper's at 7. If there's anything to cook." He turned and limped back toward the barn without another word. "Jed's been with my family for 40 years, Silas said, as if that explained everything. "He's the foreman." Silas led her to the house. The front porch sagged on one end. He opened the door and she stepped inside. The air was stale. A fine layer of dust covered every surface. The main room was large, dominated by a stone fireplace and furnished with heavy, dark wood furniture. It was a man's house. It was functional, but it lacked any touch of comfort or care. Dishes were piled in a dry sink. A stack of muddy boots stood by the door. It was a place of work and sleep, not a place of living. "The kitchen is through there," Silas said, pointing. "Your room is upstairs. First on the left." He handed her a small iron key, felt heavy in her palm. "The well is out back. Firewood is stacked on the porch. Let me know if you need anything." He hesitated, as if he wanted to say more, then seemed to think better of it. "I have chores to see to." He left her there, standing in the dusty silence of her new prison, or her new home. She was not sure which. She did not go upstairs first. She went to the kitchen. It was worse than the main room. Pots and pans hung haphazardly. The pantry was a disaster of half-empty sacks of flour and beans, with clear evidence of mice. The stove was thick with grease. For anyone else, it would be a daunting task. For Alara, it was a relief. This she understood. This was a problem with a clear solution. Chaos could be ordered. Dirt could be cleaned. Neglect could be reversed. She took off her bonnet and rolled up her sleeves. She did not wait for instructions. She did not ask for permission. This was the work she had been contracted for. She would do it. She started with the sink. She found soap hard and cracked. She hauled buckets of water from the well, her arms straining, but her body was used to the work. She heated the water on the stove, the fire catching easily in the well-designed flue. The house had good bones. She washed every dish, every pot, every piece of cutlery. She scrubbed them until they gleamed. She stacked them neatly to dry. Then she tackled the pantry. She threw out anything spoiled. She swept the floor, chasing out a startled mouse. She organized the remaining supplies, taking mental inventory. They were low on flour, salt, and coffee. They had plenty of beans and dried meat. She worked with a silent, methodical fury. It was her language. Each clean surface, each organized shelf was a sentence. I am competent. I am useful. I can bring order from chaos. She did not stop to rest. She worked until the sun began to dip below the hills, casting long shadows across the valley. The kitchen was transformed. The stove was black and clean. The floors were swept. The counters were clear. A pot of beans and salt pork simmered on the stove, filling the house with a rich, savory smell. Only then did she allow herself to go upstairs. The room was small and simple, containing a narrow bed, a small dresser, and a single window that looked out over the valley. It was Spartan, but it was clean, and the door had a heavy wooden bolt on the inside, in addition to the lock. She put the key in the lock. turned with a satisfying, solid click. She slid the bolt home. She was safe. For the first time in her life, she had a space that was entirely her own, a door she could close and lock against the world. It was a feeling so profound, so unfamiliar, it left her breathless. She stood at the window and looked out at the ranch. She could see Silas and Jed in the corral, working with a young, unruly horse. They moved with a shared, unspoken rhythm, a language of gestures and movements honed over years. Two young ranch hands were mending the fence she had noticed earlier, their hammers ringing out in the clear evening air. They were all working. They were all trying to hold this place together. She felt a strange, unwelcome pang of connection. She was part of it now. The pot of beans on the stove was her contribution. The clean kitchen was her foothold. She pushed the feeling away. It was a contract. It was work. Nothing more. But as she turned from the window in the quiet security of her locked room, she knew that was a lie. Something had already changed. She had imposed her will on a small corner of this world, and it had yielded. It was a start. Weeks turned into a month. Alara settled into a rhythm. She rose before the sun, her footsteps the first to sound in the quiet house. She made coffee, strong and black, the way she saw Silas drink it. She cooked breakfast, a mountain of flapjacks and bacon for the 4 men. She packed their lunches, and then the house was hers. She waged a quiet, relentless war against the years of neglect. She scrubbed floors until the original grain of the wood showed through. She mended curtains. She beat the dust out of rugs. She learned the house's secrets, the floorboard that creaked, the window that stuck, the corner of the cellar that stayed coolest. She made it hers not through ownership, but through knowledge. The men accepted her presence as a fact of life. The 2 young hands, Tom and Billy, were shy around her at first, barely meeting her eyes. But after a week of her steady, silent competence and the reliable warmth of her meals, they started to relax. They would thank her quietly for supper. Billy even left a small bouquet of wildflowers on the kitchen table one morning. Jed, the foreman, remained a grunting enigma. He never spoke to her directly, but she would sometimes see him watching her from the barn doorway. His gaze was no longer just appraising. There was something else in it now, a grudging respect. And then there was Silas. He remained a puzzle. He was unfailingly polite, his manner formal and distant. He left her wages on the kitchen table every Saturday morning, a small stack of coins. He never entered the kitchen when she was working. He respected her space, her domain. Their conversations were brief and functional. "We're low on flour," she would say. "I'll add it to the list," he would reply. But he noticed everything. He noticed when she reorganized the tool shed, putting everything in its right place. He noticed when she started a small vegetable garden near the house, tilling the hard soil herself. He never commented, but the next day, a brand new spade and hoe would be leaning against the porch railing. He spoke in actions, not words. She still did not trust him, but she was beginning to understand him. The competence test came on a hot, dry afternoon in late summer. The creek that watered their main pasture had slowed to a trickle. It was fed by a spring higher up in the hills, and every year at this time, the men had to clear the narrow channel that brought the water down. This year something was wrong. They had been gone since morning, and the water level had not risen. Alara could see them from the porch, for figures far up the hillside, clustered around a spot where the channel disappeared into a grove of rocks and aspens. They were digging, moving rocks. They had been at it for hours, their movements getting slower, more frustrated. She knew that pasture was the lifeblood of the ranch. Without that water, the grass would burn up, and Silas would have to sell off cattle he couldn't afford to lose. She packed a basket with bread, cheese, and a large jug of cold water from the well. It was an excuse. She needed to see the problem for herself. Her father had taught her to read the land, to understand how water flowed. It was a skill he had valued until he realized it was wasted on a daughter. She walked up the hill, her heavy boots sure on the rocky ground. As she got closer, she could hear their voices, tight with frustration. It's blocked solid, Tom was saying. Must be a rockfall deep inside. We'll have to dynamite it, Jed grunted. Only way. Silas was standing slightly apart, staring at the blockage, his face grim. Dynamite could collapse the whole channel. We could lose the spring for good. They fell silent as she approached, for pairs of eyes turned to her, surprised to see her there. I brought water, she said simply, setting the basket down. They drank gratefully, passing the jug around. Alara ignored them. Her eyes were on the problem. The water channel, which should have been flowing freely, disappeared into a jumble of rocks and earth at the base of a steep slope. It looked like a simple cave-in, but something was wrong. The ground is too wet, she said, thinking aloud. Silas looked at her. What? She pointed. Here she walked to the edge of the blockage, a good 20 feet to the side of where they had been digging. The soil here is saturated. And look at these aspens. Their leaves are turning yellow. It's too early for that. The men stared at her, then at the trees. She was right. The leaves were sickly and pale. Aspen roots seek water, she continued, her voice gaining confidence as she spoke about something she knew. They'll follow a water source and wrap around it, thick as a man's arm. You don't have a rockfall. You have a root block. The main channel is clear, but the roots have formed a dam just beneath the surface, forcing the water sideways into the soil. She looked at where they had been digging. You're digging in the wrong place. The blockage isn't where the water stops. It's 20 feet upstream from there. You need to dig here. She kicked at the soft, damp earth with the toe of her boot. Dead silence. The four men looked at the ground, at the trees, and then at her. Tom and Billy looked confused. Jed's mouth was a thin line. Silas crouched down where she had indicated. He scooped up a handful of soil. It was dark and muddy. He let it run through his fingers. He stood up and looked at her, his expression one of pure, undisguised astonishment. It was the first time she had ever seen him look at her as something other than a housekeeper or a problem he had solved. He was looking at her mind. Get the shovels, he said to the young hands, his voice quiet. They dug. Jed joined in, his movements stiff but powerful. Within 10 minutes, they hit it. A thick, tangled mass of white and yellow roots, woven together into a dense, impenetrable wall. It took another hour of hard work with axes and shovels to clear it. When the last root was severed, there was a deep gurgling sound, and then with a rush, the water broke free, surging down the cleared channel. A ragged cheer went up from Tom and Billy. Jed leaned on his shovel, breathing heavily. He caught Alara's eye. He gave a single, sharp nod. It was the highest praise she had ever seen him give. Silas walked over to her. He stood for a moment, just looking at her, a strange expression on his face. You saved the pasture, he said. It was not a thank you. It was a statement of fact. I know how water moves, she said, uncomfortable under his intense gaze. What else do you know? He asked, his voice low and serious. What else can you do? The question hung in the air between them. It was an invitation. It was an acknowledgement. He was seeing past the wide hips and the strong back. He was seeing her. I can read, she said, and I can do sums. A flicker of something, interest, calculation, passed through his eyes. He nodded slowly. Supper was good, he said, abruptly changing the subject. Then he turned and walked back to the others, leaving her standing alone on the hillside, the sound of running water filling the air. It was the first compliment he had ever given her. It was about her cooking, a simple, domestic thing. But she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that he was not just talking about the food. He was talking about everything. A crack in the wall. It was getting wider. Vuge. A week later, he approached her after supper. The young hands had gone to the bunkhouse, and Jed was smoking his pipe on the porch. Alara was wiping down the kitchen table. Silas stood in the doorway, holding a thick, leather-bound book. A ledger. You said you could do sums, he said. It was not a question. I can, she confirmed, her hands stilling on the table. He walked in and placed the ledger on the clean wood surface. He opened it. The pages were filled with columns of numbers, written in a neat, precise hand. "This is the ranch's ledger," he said. "My father kept it. I've kept it since he passed." He ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of frustration. "We should be profitable. The beef prices are high. Our losses to wolves have been minimal. But every month we fall a little further behind. I'm selling off cattle to pay the bills. I feel like I'm trying to fill a bucket with a hole in it." He looked at her, his gaze direct. "I've gone over these numbers 100 times. I can't find the hole. I was hoping a fresh pair of eyes." It was a request for help. It was an admission of vulnerability. It was an act of profound trust. He was handing her the financial soul of his ranch, the record of his family's legacy and his own struggle. She felt a tremor of fear. This was more than just clearing a block channel. This was the heart of the operation. If she failed, if she saw nothing, she would lose the small measure of respect she had just earned. But the challenge was irresistible. Puzzle made of numbers. A story told in ink and paper. "I will look," she said. For the next 3 nights, after the house was quiet, Alara sat at the kitchen table with the ledger and a lamp. She did not just look at the numbers. She looked for the story behind them. She cross-referenced invoices for feed with the number of cattle. She compared transport costs with market prices. She built a map of the ranch's finances in her head. On the first night, she found nothing. The numbers were clean, the additions correct. On the second night, she found the discrepancies. They were small, almost unnoticeable. An invoice for 10 sacks of seed when the planting records only showed a need for 8. A bill for veterinary services for a horse that had been sold 6 months prior. A receipt for fence wire that was 20% higher than the last one, from the same supplier. Each one was a small thing, easily dismissed as a clerical error or a minor overcharge. But there were dozens of them. On the third night, she found the pattern. The small overcharges, the phantom invoices, they all originated from one place, the town's main supplier, Sterling Mercantile. And every inflated receipt, every fraudulent bill was initialed for approval. The initials were not SB for Silas Blackwood. They were RS. She stared at the initials, her blood running cold. RS. Richard Sterling, the owner of the Mercantile, a man known for his polished boots, his charming smile, and his ever-expanding portfolio of land. He was buying up failing ranches all over the county. People said he was just a savvy businessman with good luck. Alara knew she was not looking at luck. She was looking at a quiet, patient, and utterly ruthless campaign of financial sabotage. Sterling was not waiting for the ranch to fail. He was making it fail one overpriced sack of feed at a time. He was bleeding Silas dry, so slowly that Silas himself hadn't seen it. She felt a surge of cold fury on Silas's behalf. He was a good man, an honest man. He believed in hard work and a fair deal. He was completely unprepared for an enemy who fought with poisoned ink instead of a gun. She gathered her findings, making a neat list of every discrepancy, every questionable invoice, every forged initial. The evidence was overwhelming. It was a snake, coiled in the pages of the ledger. The next morning, she waited for him. When he came in for coffee, she had the ledger open on the table, her notes beside it. "I found the hole," she said quietly. He sat down. She explained it to him step by step. She showed him the patterns, the inflated costs, the initials. She did not offer her conclusion. She just laid out the facts, letting him see the picture for himself. As he listened, his face hardened. The weary frustration was replaced by a dangerous stillness. The assessing blue of his eyes turned to chips of ice. When she was finished, he was silent for a long time. He traced the initials RS with his finger. "I've known Richard Sterling since we were boys," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "He was my father's friend. He's the executor of my father's will." The betrayal was deeper than she had imagined. It was not just a business rival. It was a trusted friend, a figure of authority. "He's been stealing from you for years," she said, "slowly enough that you wouldn't notice. He's trying to force you into foreclosure, so he can buy the land for pennies on the dollar." Silas stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. He walked to the window and looked out at the land his family had worked for 3 generations. "I'm going into town," he said, his back to her. "I'm going to have a talk with Mr. Sterling." The way he said it sent a chill down her spine. He was not going to talk. He was going to confront. It would be his word against a pillar of the community. A poor rancher against a rich merchant. She knew how that story ended. "No," she said. He turned, surprised by her tone. "You can't," she insisted. "He'll deny it. He'll call you a liar. He has the whole town in his pocket. He'll ruin your reputation, and then he'll finish ruining you. You can't fight him with anger, Silas. You have to fight him with this." She tapped the ledger. "You have to be smarter." He looked at her, then at the book. The anger was still radiating off him, a palpable heat, but he was listening. Just then, the sound of an approaching carriage echoed in the yard. It was a fine, polished carriage, pulled by 2 high-stepping black horses. It was a vehicle of wealth and power. Silas and Alara looked at each other. They both knew who it was. A moment later, a man appeared in the open doorway. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. He had a warm, friendly smile that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Silas, my boy," Richard Sterling said, his voice smooth as silk. "I was just passing by. Thought I'd check in on you." His gaze swept the room and landed on Alara. The smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He had not expected her. He had not expected a new variable. Then his eyes flickered down to the open ledger on the table between them. The smile vanished completely. He recovered quickly, his charming mask slipping back into place. But Alara had seen it. The flicker of surprise, the flash of cold assessment. He knew they were onto him. His eyes met hers, and in that moment she understood. He was not just an enemy to Silas. He was an enemy to her. He looked her up and down, a dismissive, insulting appraisal. Well, Sterling said, his tone dripping with condescension. "I see you've acquired some new assets. Isn't this the little filly from that sad spectacle in town? The one your father couldn't give away? I must say, Silas, I'm surprised. I thought you had better taste." He was trying to put her in her place, to remind Silas of her shameful origins, to reduce her to the object she had been on the auction block. But Alara was not that woman anymore. She did not flinch. She did not look away. She met his gaze and held it, her expression as cold and hard as a winter stone. The battle lines had been drawn, and Richard Sterling had just made the fatal mistake of underestimating his opponent.